Okay, welcome everyone to today's ARF Insights Studio webinar. I'm Matt Voda, CEO of OptiMine, and joining me today is Peter Rice. Peter is the Director of Marketing Systems Strategy at Kepler. Before we begin, a few notes about participating in today's webcast. We're recording today's session, and this recording will be available to share with colleagues who are not able to attend today. And secondly, we invite you to use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions. We have a Q&A section at the end of today's webinar, but we'll also try to address questions as we move along during the webcast. So with that, let's get started. As all of you are aware, Apple made privacy-related changes on its devices earlier this year. And in today's presentation, we'll recap those changes, how they impact you as a marketer. We'll review what we're seeing in the market and from the brands that we serve. And after that, we'll cover some important upcoming privacy changes that will likely further impact us all. And we'll speak about some best practices and a framework about how each of you and your brands can think about future-proofing your own marketing measurement in light of these significant privacy challenges. A quick word about OptiMine. We're a future-proof marketing measurement and optimization solution that helps brands measure the incremental contributions of their digital and traditional marketing across both online and offline conversions. And today's topic is near and dear to our hearts and to the brands that we speak to in the market who are looking for measurement solutions. They have similar questions and concerns as you. And that is really focused on, how do we evaluate the changes happening in the market and the data deprecation challenges that we face collectively? And most importantly, what do we do about it to future-proof our own efforts going forward?
Hey everyone. I know there are a number of Kepler sort of family members on the line, but for those of you who don't know Kepler, obviously data is really important to us. We are rooted in helping brands harness data and technology. And so as this space is changing, we keep really close eye on trends like iOS 14.5. As an organization, we started in 2012. We've grown to over 550 people actually at this point. We have offices in the US, London, San Jose, Costa Rica, and Singapore. We've deployed more than $3 billion in media. We focus on data-driven, CRM-based marketing. And 2.5 years ago, we joined the Q Collective, which is part of Takahodo DY and a range of brands that you may have heard of. Matt, if you'll jump forward, like IDEO, Sidley, and others.
Great, thanks, Peter. As I mentioned, today's agenda, we will recap the changes made in iOS 14.5 and actually preview big changes that happened last week in iOS 15, recapping the impacts being seen in the market, and then speaking about privacy changes moving forward, what they mean for your brand, and lastly, we'll be talking about a future-proofing framework in terms of planning for your own brand in dealing with these data and tracking challenges. As I mentioned earlier, we will save time at the end for Q&A, so please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions, and we'll make sure that we cover those as we go. Okay, so let's jump in and dive into some of the details. So in April of this year, Apple rolled out a significant privacy-related change called App Tracking Transparency, or ATT for short. And Apple's ATT changes cover two main areas. First is that all Apple device users, whether you're using an iPhone, a Mac, or Apple TV, are prompted to opt in to cross-site tracking by any app, including those from Apple. And we'll explore what this means in a bit more detail in a minute, but it's a very significant change. And importantly, the default for Apple is an opt-out. So users must opt in to allow this cross-device tracking. Secondly, Apple has rolled out their privacy labels, which are really kind of like a nutrition label on food, except the privacy labels describe in very precise terms how an app tracks you, the kinds of data it collects, how it shares that data with other apps. And if you haven't seen one of these yet, actually look at one for Facebook. It's a fairly significant amount of transparency, and it's quite eye-opening. And functionally, when a user asks an app not to track them, the Apple device will no longer share an identifier, the IDFA, that links the user with the ads that have been served. So now there's a disconnect for attribution that's been introduced into the picture when the user doesn't choose to be tracked. Why is Apple doing this? You could speculate about their strategy and being different in the market compared to Google on the basis of privacy, or whether they're going to come up with their own more significant advertising play. But the changes really aren't new. This is not a new strategy. And it's really part of a broader effort that they started rolling out a few years ago. Peter, if you want to take the next slide here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not the first change that Apple's made. In fact, it's probably not the first change that the ecosystem's seen with Safari, Firefox, and a variety of other updates. But I think one of the reasons that this change gets talked about so much more is due to scale. Looking at a variety of Kepler's clients, this is web data only, so it doesn't even account for app users. We see iOS users make up between 25 and 50% of the user pool for any given brand. And I think because of that, we see, if you'll jump to that next one, that variation can really, really drive an amplified impact. So for brands who operate in the app space as opposed to the web space, or brands in industries where they have heavier iOS usage, that impact can be even higher. And as a result of that impact, Matt, you can jump to the next slide. The drop off can be really significant. So with the ATT opt-in, according to Kochava, about 40%, just under 40%, that number does fluctuate, but about 40% of prompted users are allowing apps to track, which means that obviously 60% are blocking tracking. So 60% of 30, 40, 50% of your user base, that can amount to a really huge impact in tracking. And so that's about 15%. We actually saw that confirmed last week from a Facebook VP of product marketing, that they are estimating about 15% of potential tracked conversions are actually missing. So this is a really, really significant dynamic in terms of what it does to your real-time and deterministic data to make marketing decisions with.
Yeah, and because Facebook is more heavily mobile-centric, Apple's privacy changes over the last few years have caused a slew of challenges. This is just the latest of several. Facebook's own attribution window, the window of time they use to measure ad conversions, has already been shortened from 28 days down to 7. And this was a direct result of Apple's changes with intelligent tracking protection or prevention, ITP. In February of this year, Facebook rather quietly posted on their own blog that they were turning off A/B testing with holdout groups. Probably for the same reason. It's very difficult to run a clean holdout group that has gaps in it as a result of these opt-outs. You can't maintain a clean, stable test versus control when you can't guarantee that users are hopping between those two sides. Facebook also announced that their store visits optimization, lift studies, and custom audiences for store visits have been disabled. Same reason. If your match rates have problems, from device to in-store traffic, it's harder to have a competent read on advertising lift on in-store traffic as a result. It's anticipated that view-through conversion tracking will face substantial losses as a result of Apple's changes. I think that's fair to say that it's already happening. And really, as an added bonus, and this really isn't a Facebook specific issue, Apple's ATT changes are causing last touch metrics to look a lot worse. So if you're relying on GA or your Adobe Analytics on a last click or last touch basis to tell you the story of campaign performance, it's going to look a lot worse. It probably already has. Your SEO team is welcoming the added boost in traffic, but it's not real. It's actually leaking off of your campaigns. So this isn't just about mobile apps. Apple's changes are impacting a major component of the digital advertising ecosystem and creating a larger set of measurement challenges for brands. So before we continue, we wanted to take a minute to take a poll. We're going to take a quick pause and let you all weigh in. We have a real-time poll for you to participate. It's anonymous. To answer the question, how have marketing results impacted you and your measurement? There's a link in the chat function that you can hit, or you can follow the directions on the screen, and we can watch this come in real time. So take a minute to share with us all what you're seeing. Again, there's a link in the chat that you can hit to answer the survey, and it is anonymous. So while we're waiting for this to come in, you can take a look at, looks like 11 to 20% may be the winner here, but we'll take a second to wait. The suspense is killing me, Peter.
I think we may have seeded an answer with our 15% drop off here, but I think it's safe to say there's been a lot of impact, and I think there's also a lot of people who still aren't sure, which I think is a fair answer as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for participating. It looks like the overwhelming evidence would be the kind of that 11 to 20% reduction in performance. And I know we have a number of folks who aren't necessarily in the marketing function, and maybe those are people that aren't as sure.
Yeah.
I'm kind of surprised that 13% of people saying this has had zero impact, but there are cases where if you're not doing mobile specific marketing, this may have a lot smaller effect.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Matt. I think it shows how there is no real one size fits all soundbite answer to what the impact is here. It goes back to the fact that iOS shares different by brand. It goes back to the fact that that targeting strategies may be different by brand. Some brands have really hyper targeted strategies, and some brands are more broad. And you're going to see variation within across all of those axes.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Well, this is great. Thanks again, everyone, for sharing. And it's a good segue into the next section of today's webinar.
Yes, definitely. So I thought I would talk about some of the ways that we're seeing these impacts. And I think we're going to look at both some anonymized Kepler data as well as data from OptiMine in this section. We can boil it down to, I think, 4 key trends, which we're going to dig into a little bit. So increasing costs, especially in highly targeted ecosystems, and those with large pools of known users. So Facebook has a lot of deterministic data, and as deterministic data gets harder to come by, that spend can shift towards those platforms. In the place of deterministic tracking, modeled conversions are one of the ways that platforms are refactoring some of that, but there are challenges that come with that. And tied to that, we see decreased volume and delayed conversions, and that adds complexity to the decision-making process. And then I think the last thing that we'll talk about, which will lead into, as Matt talked about, thinking about your measurement system more broadly, is how the typical relationship between your platform tracking and your incremental conversions can change as a result of technical and not true sort of systemic adjustments. So the first thing we're going to look at here is cost. So here we see a chart of CPM. This is for a client who is running a large amount of media across a variety of social and display channels or platforms. And we see both in social and display a pretty significant upward trend in cost. And it's worth noting that obviously there are some macro effects that go beyond iOS impact alone, seasonality, and sort of rise in competition. But what we do see is this continued trend upward from the time of iOS 14 launch to 80% adoption. Now we have seen that start to level out a bit, and I think it makes sense that there would be some leveling out. The market would start to understand the new norms, but to that trend, we've seen from Business Insider 30% quarter over quarter and almost 90% year over year growth in CPM, Facebook ad prices, Snapchat and TikTok, similar trends. And when you dig in, like I said, to more niche audiences, we really see that amplified. And I think it's safe to say that prices are going to continue to increase. And so what that means for brands is an increase in the price that you're clearing at is simply going to show up in lack of efficiency, or you're going to have to think about your targeting strategy more broadly. So brands should expect to see natural declines in efficiency due to that higher baseline media cost. Similarly, Matt alluded to the restriction in attribution windows. So where brands used to have 28-day click and 7-day view windows available to them, that's been cut down. So looking at data here, Matt, you can animate through these. That Facebook is sort of a microcosm here, where the restriction in data and the deterioration of long-term user trackability has required them, or has forced them to cut down on their look-back windows. So looking at data from 2019, when we had larger look-back windows and less of the effect of deterioration in conversions, that cut in look-back window alone represented for this brand a 10% drop in conversion volume. For brands with longer consideration periods, this could be even higher, 30–40% drop off in baseline conversion volume. And so what that means is brands are dealing with fewer attributed conversions, which means more variance in conversion data, meaning that you have to either spend more, drive more conversions, or wait longer to normalize those trends and be able to accrue sufficient data to know that you're making accurate decisions and not making decisions that are simply based on low volumes of data. So that decreased signal can have a really important effect on the cycle with which you're able to optimize and the cycle with which you're able to make informed decisions. And we see this in OptiMine as well. So OptiMine collects as a counterpoint to their model conversions, reported conversions. These would be conversions that would come from either the platform or network, Facebook Ads Manager, Snapchat, or web analytics, Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, and so forth. And so looking for one client at paid social prospecting, we see a sort of steady decline through the rollout of iOS 14.5 in ROAS. That can be attributed to a number of factors, but largely this is going to be attributed to that drop off in attributable conversions, that 15% drop off that Facebook indicated. And if you actually look at Facebook specifically for this client, we see that even more amplified. So this brand saw nearly 40% worse performance April versus August. And I think you can attribute this to the fact that Facebook has a really highly mobile audience, a high mobile users, and also a really high number of iOS users for this brand. So that said, it's not just a simple science. So if you look at Pinterest as an example for this brand, we actually see performance improve. So platform performance improve. And I think you can attribute this to a variety of factors. Pinterest does still have high mobile usage, but there is a larger desktop component. Pinterest is also a platform that behaves a little bit more like a search platform than Facebook does in terms of searching for different kinds of pins. And so I think you could potentially point to the fact that Pinterest's model of delivering targeted impressions is somewhat less impacted by having that deterministic signal. But I think most importantly, what this says is that you can't generalize, and you have to look, and you have to have a reliable signal. And I think platform tracking, where we've been able to in the past rely on that identity matching to give us a really consistent day over day, week over week, month over month signal, that's what's really changing. We have more of a question mark as to how much of the performance signal that we're seeing is due to true performance trends, and how much of it is due to shifts in technology, shifts in trackability, shifts in user behavior in opting in or opting out. That question mark is getting bigger and bigger. And as a result, the tracked conversion versus the sort of halo effect of conversions is getting larger and larger. That delta is increasing. And so for a lot of brands, what this means is that measurement drop off is leading to sort of having to scratch your head a little bit more about how much can I trust my platform data? And platform data is extremely important to Kepler as a targeted media agency, because it allows us to be nimble, make good decisions. And so that doesn't mean that platform tracking is broken or gone, but we need to make sure that we're understanding the difference between technical drop-off and performance drop-off. So the sort of last thought that I want to leave you with relating to that is using programmatic display as an example. For this brand, we see reported ROAS dropping pretty substantially and consistently throughout the period of the rollout of iOS. And this is, again, platform reported. So this is reporting that's coming due to having that linked ID between impression and conversion. But it's missing that cross-channel halo effect entirely. So if we look at reported ROAS versus modeled ROAS, we actually see a very different story. One, modeling, OptiMine's model, which looks to identify signals that indicate incremental ROAS, shows both a 5 times greater value in display than what platform is showing, and also a much more subtle decrease in performance drop-off, right? That divergence between platform and modeled or sort of incremental ROAS has amplified. And so if you don't have sort of a multifaceted measurement approach, you can struggle to identify the differences in and isolate the differences in what is platform-based or what is performance-based changes. So I think, Matt, feel free to hop in here if you have any thoughts. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the measurement system in a minute, but I think it's also worth underlining how this iOS effect is not the only effect that we have to think about going forward too.
Peter, there was a question from the audience about SEM and how does this impact paid search? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that speaks to the complexity of understanding, of monitoring all of these changes. For search engine marketing, generally speaking, there is less identity signal than other platforms. So I think there isn't a single channel where the impact is completely null. Perhaps contextual targeting is one example where there really is no identity signal. But many search engine marketers are not using things like remarketing lists for search, RLSA, and Google Ads. If you're using RLSA, then the impact might be higher for you. If you're not using RLSA, then search acts a little bit closer to a contextual platform where search query alignment is a stronger signal. It is, however, going to have an impact on your tracking. So I think it's worth drawing a differentiation between the impact that this will have on your targeting efficiency versus your tracking efficiency. And I think where we'll see much more consistent impact is in tracking efficiency.
Yeah. And if you were relying on track signals, in particular for non-brand search, you probably weren't seeing really great ROAS anyway. And our recommendation would be to use some other methods to fully account for the branding effect or the halo effect of non-brand search, to educate consumers who may know a little less about your brand but are still on that purchase journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that speaks to the impact of time here too. So with attribution windows getting shorter, whether the platform is restricting them or simply data is dropping off faster, that long tail effect is becoming harder and harder to measure.
Yeah. We had another question about how we're determining the model ROAS and are we taking site analytics into the model? I'll take that one, Peter. So the model ROAS is looking at, in this particular case, it's a very high scale MMM. So we're correlating impressions on a daily basis, in this case for programmatic display campaigns, with sales and traffic outcomes over time. And the model result is accounting for the incremental lift of those impressions and recalibrating ROAS once we've computed the incremental lift driven by the campaign. We do take in site analytics, and one of the things you're seeing here is the reported number on the left. So the web analytics platform of truth is an input into the model, but ultimately that's more for comparative purposes. You know, how is the answer I'm getting from Adobe or GA different than the answer I'm getting from the model, and how do I think differently about my investment strategy, you know, when I see differences like this. So technically, yes, we are bringing that in, but the models are looking at impressions and the variance of those impressions on a daily basis with an outcome that the brand is looking to understand. It's a power user question.
I think from our perspective, that point is a really important one for us, Matt, that the OptiMine model, the model output is isolated from the effects of data drop off. As long as we have those sort of delivery metrics, impressions, things like that, then we get two reads, and we can start to triangulate and make decisions off of that. So I think the isolation from the deterministic signals is a really important factor to us in terms of our work that we do with media mix modeling and media mix model output.
Peter, the last point I'll make on that is that you know, it's specific to attribution windows themselves. So as the platforms shorten their attribution windows, you know, you're cutting off a lot of value. So, you know, we may see, for this example, a programmatic display campaign, it may have a lag or a carryover, you know, up to 30 to 60 days after the campaign ran. There's a branding effect that persists, and so you tend to lop off that halo when you're looking at shorter and shorter attribution windows, and as a result, you know, the investment decisions are going to be based on maybe only a partial answer. So the attribution window itself, that halo effect, for some more kind of mid or upper funnel digital, it's going to be longer than 7 days. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind when you want to account for the full value or contribution of the campaign itself. All right. Great questions. Keep them coming. So thank you, Peter, for that. Next, we'll cover some additional privacy-related changes coming up that will continue to obscure the marketing measurement picture, things for all of us to plan and prepare for. I think it's fair to say that most folks are aware of what Google is doing with cookies, and Apple's changes, while very significant, are going to pale in comparison to Google's own privacy changes. And here's what we know. And there are some things that are still evolving that we don't know. Google has already communicated that they're dropping the third-party cookie from Chrome. That's pretty well known. But Google also plans to stop all individually targeted ads as part of this move. And they're not going to support industry identity solutions such as, Unified ID or others. They're kind of going it alone from an ad targeting perspective. And with that, they plan on moving towards a cohort-based approach to advertising targeting called Google Flock, federated learning of cohorts. And they delayed that rollout, or at least they announced the delay this year. They will, in Q1 of 2022, resume testing of Flock, active in-market testing, and there will be a series of changes that they'll be making, probably second half of 2022, ultimately in early 2023, based on their latest guidance. They'll shut down third-party cookie support in Chrome. So I can't understate the impacts of this move from a measurement standpoint. Tracking will be negatively impacted, and brands will also be more reliant on Google to tell them the value of Google Ads, which is frankly, it's a difficult proposition, and it makes the case for independent marketing performance measurement and the need to have this church and state separation. We're not saying that we'd recommend abandoning the platform measurement tools themselves. There's valuable guidance that can be provided, but we think there's a risk in relying on those as your sole mechanism to tell you the story of value or performance with your campaigns. Apple's not done yet either. Last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, iOS 15 went live, and the new privacy changes will impact email marketers. So MPP, or mail privacy protection, is a new feature in iOS 15. It blocks reporting of email opens, as well as the use of IP addresses for cross-device matching and tracking. And it creates a new disposable email address feature. As a user, if you're signing up for a newsletter or what have you, you can use this new disposable email as a way to hide your identity and prevent that email address from being used as a common identifier across devices. This last stat really surprised me. I didn't know Apple Mail was such a significant portion of the market, but about half of all email opens are from Apple Mail. So this is dependent on user use of this feature, much like ATT, but the potential impact to email measurement is going to be significant. And frankly, it's just more evidence that Apple will continue to march down this privacy path. They had several releases of ITP over the last few years, playing kind of cat and mouse games with the marketing tech community. I think it's safe to say that they're going to continue on the same march to come. One thing that we didn't talk about in today's webinar is the major uptick in privacy-related regulations. So state by state privacy regulations, that's its own force that's happening here. And so as we net out, the privacy-based disruption that's happening that impact all of us, regulations are a big part of this. There are somewhere between 12 and 15 states with active legislation in their state houses to enact similar privacy rights. A wave kind of kicked off with California a few years ago. For some reason, this is one of only a few issues that seems to have support across the aisle. And so I think we can expect to see kind of this continued patchwork of states enacting their own slightly different versions of privacy regs. Obviously, we've talked about the tech players reducing targeting and tracking and providing more end user controls from a privacy standpoint. So there are major new risks for brands in the use of tracking-based measurement and attribution. And really, I think we're seeing some of the most significant disruption in the digital space in decades. And because of this, brands need to think and plan now for how they will future-proof their own measurement approaches moving forward. So that's where we're going to next from a webinar standpoint. And I promise we'll continue to answer your questions as we go along. All right, so OptiMine's developed a framework for brands to think about future-proofing from a measurement standpoint. And we call it the 4 A's. And if we start with the assumption that these tracking-based approaches are going to continue to come under pressure and that the data picture will become less and less complete over time, then we need to think and begin to think now about taking active steps. And here at OptiMine, we talk about future-proofing with the brands that we serve. And while the framework that we've developed would cover its own webinar, I'll share, at least at a high level, the approach that we recommend brands and your own brand taking. So starting with the upper left-hand quadrant, the assessment phase. This part of the methodology is aimed at understanding where you are from a current state. Where in your marketing operation are you using tracking? Where are you reliant on PII from a measurement standpoint? How is it being used? What systems or reporting that get cascaded throughout the organization are relying on it? And this is a little more related to state-by-state regulations, but if you're going to go through these steps, you really should be mapping out how this PII is being shared with outside vendors and systems. And this, again, has more to do with the right to be forgotten, or the right to ask not to be tracked, or to have the data sold, new rights with the state-by-state regs. And so a pro tip that we coach clients on is that if your compliance team has already looked into CCPA compliance, as an example, so California Privacy Act, they probably did all this mapping already. And if you weren't involved in it as a marketer, they probably have this documented in spades, because they had to prove compliance teams, this is why they exist, proving that end-to-end chain around PII, when that request to be forgotten comes in, that they can kind of prove it, not only in your own systems, but third-party vendor systems as well. So first step, take stock of your current state. Moving on from there, from assessment, as you begin to consider new measurement methods that are future-proof, there's an important, more cultural step to ensure alignment across your stakeholders. So if you are going to change how you measure, and you're basically uprooting the means with which different teams kind of keep score, you've got to look at marketing channel owner alignment, your analytics team support, even finance, certainly your agency partners and other vendors, to make sure that they're on board with the changes and that they're supporting the evolution in terms of how you're measuring performance. The risk is that unaligned partners become roadblocks. It could be passive resistance, where they just continue to use their own things, or it could be more active. And the challenge then is, how do you coalesce around a new approach when you've got people that are kind of not on board? So this gets to the topic of leadership, which leads us to the concept of accountability next. And driving accountability is critical. And certainly we face this when we come in with a new brand who becomes a client of OptiMine. We may represent a change in terms of how they make decisions. And one of our goals is to work with the marketing leadership to ensure that not only do we have executive sponsorship in support of these changes, but that executive leadership aligns the decision processes with the teams and forces accountability, ensures adoption, and kind of baking this or ingraining it in with all the stakeholders. Again, with the risk being that there's a vacuum of leadership, you kind of fall back into teams cherry picking their own preferred measurement, usually the ones that put their own things in the best light, or teams are ignoring the change and performance suffers as a result. So culture and leadership and accountability, which have nothing to do with the mechanics of measurement, are really important to future-proofing and change. And finally, assuming the brand achieves measurement maturity through good adoption, there's an additional element of this for a culture of continuous improvement. And we think that continuous improvement can be guided by more agile analytics. So the brands that we serve, the ones that perform best, consider measurement in rapid agile sprints, testing media, testing creative, trying new channels in rapid sprints, and then following up with measurement to see how these things worked, where do we need to adjust, how do we continually drive performance improvement in these short continuous bursts across the whole portfolio that's being managed. And hopefully this points to the fact that, by merely understanding the technical changes or details of these changes isn't enough, that to evolve with the things that are happening in market, with the next change from Apple, with the changes coming from Google, you've got to continually recalibrate, retest, and read performance. We certainly saw this with the disruption of the pandemic over the last 18 months or so, when consumer behavior shifted so significantly. The brands that we were working with, the ones that were testing and recalibrating based on those huge behavioral shifts, were able to more quickly adjust and perform better by taking this very approach. So it isn't a simple set of steps to achieve success, but it's a proactive and deliberate effort involving key stakeholders and certainly marketing leadership within your brand. I can share this framework in a more detailed guide as a follow-up to today's webinar. If you want a copy of it, we have a whole guide on this. It goes into more detail. Just send me the contact information in the chat. I'm happy to share that. All right, so now we're going to transition into Q&A. And let me just switch here. We have some questions here.
Yeah, Matt, I can read off some of these questions, but I actually have a question for you before we get started. Kepler, we sort of fully agree with the significance of that measurement framework, but I think what we've seen is it's not an immediate march. So for marketers who are on the line, or it's not an immediate flip that you can switch to turn on a system like that. For marketers on the line who don't have that framework in place, help me to contextualize how long you think we should be working to get to that ideal state.
Yeah, it's typically handled in a series of phases. So usually there's some organizational things. We recommend what we call a center of excellence model, where you get the different stakeholders that either are part of the measurement and decision process or are impacted by it, all have representation in what we call a COE, a center of excellence. And it doesn't mean that you have to reorg your whole team structure. It just means that there's an alignment around the COE approach to manage this new capability. And as stakeholders in managing this new measurement approach, that they're working with every team on making better decisions. There's a confidence building phase that happens with the inception of the COE, and sometimes that can take some months to get to confidence, whether through validation of the recommendations coming from measurement. Let's take this guidance that we're getting and test it in market to see, is it correct? Is it guiding us in the right way? Can we make confident decisions across the whole budget or not? And so that's an important step. You can't change how people make decisions until there's good alignment and confidence in the data that's being used. And so the kind of the third phase, the nirvana phase, is kind of that activation of this agile mentality. It may take some time to get there as well, but typically, making this transition, it can happen over the course of 2, 4, 6 months if the brand is dedicated to it and if the leaders are holding the teams accountable to make the change.
Yeah.
That's the key kind of accelerator, and gets people on board to really power through it.
Yeah, that's great. I think conversations like these and talking about these dynamics are a really important way that we've seen brands and marketers who see the writing on the wall able to underline and gain that buy-in to be able to sort of hit the accelerator on that. I will ask one question, and I'll give sort of the platform side answer. I would love to get your modeled side answer. But relating to what you said about COEs, a lot of the questions that came in are around understanding the complexity of ATT and what it will mean for different platforms. So one question: ATT is quite complex, and as users can opt into, and it can opt into one app but opt out of another app, how do you seek a deduplicated and unified impression view across various publishers and platforms? It's a really good question, and it's a really important question. So from my perspective, at least on the platform side, I think the answer is it's becoming more difficult. And I think understanding that we can't treat platform metrics as on paper perfect is a really important step. So understanding that reach has to be modeled, frequency has to be modeled, is a really important step towards being able to look at the metrics that you're seeing in the console through the right lens, right? So we know that reach and frequency are often understated, or reach is often overstated, frequency is often understated. But I think that is becoming amplified. And so understanding those dynamics and having some sort of mechanism within your brand, call it a COE or call it whatever you want, to make sure that you're understanding how these dynamics are shifting is one really important way, because you aren't going to have that deduplicated and unified view. I think it's important to come to terms with the fact that you won't have a deduplicated view, but you can still approximate that deduplicated view and make sound marketing decisions off of that. So I think there's the platform side, but I think relating to the measurement framework, Matt, I would love to hear your thoughts on where modeling can also sort of assist with that.
Yeah, of course. And this relates to another question about vendor workarounds using different kinds of identity-based approaches. So we think it's funny, what's old is new again. So marketing mix modeling, which has been used for decades, primarily to measure the broad effects of TV, is something that can be used quite effectively for digital as well. In fact, Facebook has its own open source marketing mix modeling initiative called Robin, that I think that they've looked at their future of measurement, and they're getting on board with MMM at high scale. So we think that there are techniques out there that have been used for maybe some other parts of the marketing ecosystem that come into play. And with the natural benefit of not relying on identity data to get a measurement result back to the marketer. There are valid reasons, of course, to continue to seek and rely upon identity, whether it's personalization, optimization, consumer experience types of things. But I think that to rely on that kind of data solely for measurement is a losing proposition long term, because the picture is just getting much more challenging. So, I think it also suggests that you can't rely on one single approach for how you measure. You have to apply the right kinds of tools to the right job or the right challenge. And there is not one approach. I think as digital marketers, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, relying on multi-touch attribution, that was the one approach. That doesn't work so well now, and it certainly doesn't work so well moving forward as brands kind of grapple with these gaps that are now emerging. The question, which was quite pessimistic, is what is the future of ad tech? And it seems like optimization is going to become impossible. It is going to get a lot more difficult. Targeting, personalization, optimization becomes harder and harder, a lot less perfect. And it remains to be seen how the industry is going to adjust on that basis.
Yeah, I think that segues well into a question that you sort of touched on, but I'll read the question. So analytics vendors often claim workaround use of first-party cookies, MAIDs, mobile ad IDs. So this person said, I'm not entirely sure what these are. So MAIDs, M-A-I-D, that is a mobile ad ID. That is what App Tracking Transparency Framework targets specifically. So Apple calls their mobile ad ID the IDFA. It's an ID that is the same for a user across apps. It's that thing that links everything together so that you have that unified view of reach, unified view of frequency. If somebody opts out, they are obfuscating their mobile ad ID, right? So the use of first-party cookies, that would be, mobile ad IDs are very similar to a third-party cookie in a browser ecosystem. With IDs becoming different across platforms or across sites, that connective tissue starts to break down. So Unified ID 2.0, RAMP ID, there are various non-cookie-based or non-device-based proposals that DSPs are claiming to use. This person asked, how viable are these in the long term? Are they making promises they can't keep? And I think related to the idea around optimization, these are not promises that they can't keep, but I think it's important to understand that these are not promises that are wholesale solutions or replacements for the way that we've operated in the past. So does optimization become impossible? No, but the signals that we're using change. The level of granularity that we have for levers of control change. Do the audience targeting inputs that we use go away? Not entirely, but not as holistically. And so a unified ID may have not quite the same coverage that a third-party ID has. So from a technological standpoint, I do think many of these are viable, but it's important for marketers to understand the relative utility that these will have compared to what you're used to doing today.
Great answer, Peter. Another question about Google Flock related to cohorts and whether or not the market can create their own cohorts. My understanding of Google Flock is that the cohort lives in the browser and that Google more or less defines or some Google magic defines the interest or the kind of the contextual aspects of the user browsing.
Yep. And
that creates the cohort. I think if the market could create the cohort, we would be right back into kind of one-to-one targeting. Targets cohorts of one user. Yeah, we're kind of separating that, or they are with this design.
Yeah, I think the way that I would think about it is if you brought a bunch of people into a gym and then had people who like Magic the Gathering join in one spot and people who like dodgeball join in another spot and people who I'm making this a elementary themed example unintentionally, but that's essentially what we're talking about with cohorts. And the really significant part with Flock is that advertisers can't see into that gymnasium. So I think there will be a mechanism for advertisers to control which flocks they want to target. So you'll have some concept of audience taxonomy the way you do with interest and affinity groups right now. I think it's easiest to think of flock as similar to interest and affinity. It's just a very technically different way of developing that signal and controlling the ability to make that a one-to-one relationship between audience and user.
Yeah, for sure. Helpful reminder from our friends at the IAB about CPRA. Doesn't go into effect till 2023, but brands are going to need to make sure that their data is compliant starting in 2022. CPRA, if you're less familiar, it's kind of CCPA 2.0. It's the next evolution of California's privacy regulation. It expanded rights around sexual orientation privacy, religious beliefs, and I think PHI as well. And also funded the enforcement aspect of CCPA to allow California to be more proactive in enforcing the regulation. So good reminder from IAB. It's tough sledding out there with these regs. Well, Peter, I think that's it. I think no other questions here. Certainly appreciate everyone's time today for all the great questions. Peter, thank you so much for joining with OptiMine today, and everyone have a great afternoon.